Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to a series of videos in which I am reading you a book. We are reading Barchester Towers by Anthony Trollope, which is the story of a war going on in the cathedral close in the town of Barchester between the new bishop, Dr. Prouty, and his wife, Mrs. Prouty, and their personal chaplain, Mr. Slope, and the Grantleyite forces of the town, that is, everyone who favors the old way of doing things in Barchester, and that group is led by Archdeacon Grantley. An imperious figure who recognizes in Mr. Slope a natural enemy. So there are a whole bunch of power contests going on here. In the last chapter, for instance, we saw that Mrs. Prouty and Mr. Slope, who had been allies in everything they did for most of the time that they'd been together, have now a rift. They are now arguing with each other. So at the end of the last chapter, Mr. Slope comes to the determination that Barchester isn't big enough for the both of them. But he still has enemies of his own to deal with, and one of those is Dr. Grantley. There's another enemy that has been called in, enlisted specifically for Mr. Slope, but we still haven't got to him. So we're getting a chapter called The Widow's Persecution. This is chapter 18. And it will feature Dr. Grantley. The last chapter, the bishop had an appointment to talk with Dr. Grantley, and just didn't feel up to it. He just didn't feel... He knew what it was going to be about. It was going to be about the preferment of Hiram's Hospital. Dr. Grantley wants it to go to Mr. Harding, and the bishop's wife wants it to go to someone she can control, someone, Mr. Quiverful, who would be under her thumb. And we know the bishop has set a time to meet Dr. Grantley, but we know he's not going to do that, so he's too much of a coward to do that. So this is chapter 18. Early on the following morning, Mr. Slope was summoned to the bishop's dressing room, and went there fully expecting that he should find his lordship very indignant and spirited up by his wife to repeat the rebuke which she had administered on the previous day. Mr. Slope had resolved that at any rate from him he would not stand it, and entered the dressing room in rather a combative disposition, but he found the bishop in the most placid and gentlest of humours. His lordship complained of being rather unwell, had a slight headache, and was not quite the thing in his stomach, but there was nothing the matter with his temper. "Oh, Slope," said he, taking the chaplain's proffered hand, "Archdeacon Grantley is to call on me this morning, and I really am not fit to see him. I fear I must trouble you to see him for me." Then Dr. Prouty proceeded to explain that what it was that must be said to Dr. Grantley. He was to be told, in fact, in the civilest words in which the tidings could be conveyed, that Mr. Harding, having refused the wardenship, the appointment had been offered to Mr. Quiverful and accepted by him. Mr. Slope again pointed out to his patron that he thought he was perhaps not quite wise in his decision, and this he did sotto voce. But even with this precaution it was not safe to say much, and during the little time that he did say, the bishop made a very slight but still very ominous gesture with his thumb toward the door which opened from his dressing room to some inner sanctuary. Mr. Slope at once took the hint and said no more, but he perceived that there was to be a confidence between him and his patron, that the league desired by him was to be made, and that this appointment of Mr. Quiverful was to be the last sacrifice offered on the altar of conjugal obedience. So he's gesturing at his wife, who is in the next room. All this Mr. Slope read in the slight motion of the bishop's thumb, and he read it correctly. There was no need for parchments and seals, and no need of attestations and explanations and professions. The bargain was understood between them, and Mr. Slope gave the bishop his hand on it. The bishop understood the little extra squeeze, and an intelligible gleam of assent twinkled in his eye. "Pray be civil to the Archdeacon, Mr. Slope," said he out loud, "but make him quite understand that in this matter Mr. Harding has put it out of my power to oblige him." It would be a calumny on Mrs. Prouty to suggest that she was sitting in her bedroom with her ear at the keyhole during the interview. She had within her a spirit of decorum which prevented her from descending to such baseness. To put her ear at the keyhole or to listen at a chink was a trick of a housemaid. Mrs. Prouty knew this, and therefore she did not do it. But she stationed herself rather as near the door as she could, that she might, if possible, get the advantage which the housemaid would have had without descending to the housemaid's artifice. It was little, however, that she heard, and that little was only sufficient to deceive her. She saw nothing of that friendly pressure, perceived nothing of that concluded bargain. She did not even dream of the treacherous resolves which those two false men had made together to upset her in the pride of her station, to dash the cup from her lip before she had drank of it, to sweep away all her power before she had tasted its sweets, Traitors that they were, the husband of her bosom and the outcast whom she had fostered and brought to the warmth of the world's brightest fireside. But neither of them had the magnanimity of this woman. Though two men have thus leagued themselves together against her, even yet the battle is not lost. Mr. Slope felt pretty sure that Dr. Grantley would decline the honor of seeing him. And such turned out to be the case. The Archdeacon, when the palace door was opened to him, was greeted by a note. Mr. Slope presented his compliments, etc., etc. The bishop was ill in his room and was greatly regretted, etc., etc. Mr. Slope had been charged with the bishop's views, and if agreeable to the Archdeacon, would do himself the honor, etc., etc. The Archdeacon, however, was not agreeable, and having read his note in the hall, crumpled it up in his hand, and muttering something about sorrow for his lordship's illness, took his leave without sending as much as his verbal message in answer to Mr. Slope's note. "Ill," said the Archdeacon to himself as he flung himself into his cab. "The man is absolutely a coward. He's afraid to see me. Ill indeed." The Archdeacon was never ill himself, and did not therefore understand that anyone else could in truth be prevented by illness from keeping an appointment. He regarded all such excuses as subterfuges, and in the present instance he was not far wrong. Dr. Grantley desired to be driven to his father-in-law's lodgings in High Street, and hearing from the servant that Mr. Harding was at his daughter's, followed him to Mrs. Bolt's house, and there found him. The Archdeacon was fuming with rage when he got into the drawing-room, and had by this time nearly forgotten the pusillanimity of the bishop in the villainy of the chaplain. "Look at that," he said, throwing Mr. Slope's crumpled note to Mr. Harding. "I am to be told that if I choose I may have the honor of seeing Mr. Slope, and that, too, after a positive engagement with the bishop." In other words, he wrote and asked for an appointment, and he got one. "But he says that the bishop is ill," said Mr. Harding. Pshaw, you don't mean to say that you are deceived by such an excuse as that. He was well enough yesterday. Now, I tell you what, I will see the bishop, and I will tell him also very plainly what I think of his conduct. I will see him, or else Barchester will soon be too hot to hold him." Eleanor was sitting in the room, but Dr. Grantley had hardly noticed her in his anger. Eleanor now said to him with the greatest innocence, "I wish you had seen Mr. Slope, Dr. Grantley, because I think perhaps it might have done good." Was the wrong thing to say. The Archdeacon turned on her with almost brutal wrath. Had she at once owned that she had accepted Mr. Slope for her second husband, he could hardly have felt more convinced of her belonging, body and soul, to the Slope and Proudie party than he did now on hearing her express such a wish as this. Poor Eleanor. "See him," said the Archdeacon, glaring at her, "and why am I to be called on to lower myself in the world's esteem and my own by coming into contact with such a man as that? I hitherto lived among gentlemen, and I do not mean to be dragged into other company by anybody." Poor Mr. Harding knew well that the Archdeacon meant, but Eleanor was as innocent as her own baby. She could not understand how the Archdeacon could consider himself to be dragged into bad company by descending to speak to Mr. Slope for a few minutes when the interests of her father might be served by doing so. "I was talking for a full hour yesterday to Mr. Slope," said she, with a little assumption of dignity, "and I did not feel myself lowered by it." "Perhaps not," said he, "but if you'll be good enough to allow me, I shall judge for myself in such matters. And I tell you what, Eleanor, it would be much better for you if you will allow yourself to be guided also by the advice of those who are your friends. If you do not, you will be apt to find that you have no friends left who can advise you." Eleanor blushed up to the roots of her hair, but even now she had not the slightest idea of what was passing in the Archdeacon's mind. I'll bet. No thought of love-making or love-receiving had yet found its way into her heart since the death of poor John Bold, and if it were possible that such a thought should spring there, the man must be far different from Mr. Slope that could give it birth. Nevertheless, Eleanor blushed deeply, for she felt she was charged with improper conduct, and she did so with the more inward pain because her father did not instantly rally to her side. That father for whose sake and love she had submitted to being the receptacle of Mr. Slope's confidence. She had given a detailed account of all that had passed to her father, and though he had not absolutely agreed with her about Mr. Slope's views touching the hospital, he had said nothing to make her think that she had been wrong in talking to him. She was far too angry to humble herself before her brother-in-law, and indeed, she had never accustomed herself to be very abject before him, and they had not been confidential allies. "I do not the least understand what you mean, Dr. Grantley," said she. "I do not know that I can accuse myself of doing anything that my father should disapprove. Mr. Slope called here expressly to ask what Papa's wishes were about the hospital, and as I believe he called with friendly intentions, I told him." "Friendly intentions?" sneered the Archdeacon. I believe you greatly wrong, Mr. Slope, continued Eleanor, but I have explained this to Papa already, and as you do not seem to approve of what I say, Dr. Grantley, I will, with your permission, leave you and Papa together. And so saying, she walked slowly out of the room. Pretty bad, pretty tense. Mr. Harding's not going to like that. All this made Mr. Harding very unhappy. It was quite clear that the Archdeacon and his wife had made up their minds that Eleanor was going to marry Mr. Slope. Mr. Harding could not really bring himself to think that she would do so, and yet he could not deny that circumstances made it appear that the man's company was not disagreeable to her. She was now constantly seeing him, and yet she received visits from no other unmarried gentleman. She always took his part when his conduct was canvassed, although she was aware of how personally objectionable he was to her friends. Then again, Mr. Harding felt that if she should choose to become Mrs. Slope, he had nothing he could justly urge against her doing so. She had full right to please herself, and he, as her father, could not say that she would disgrace herself by marrying a clergyman who stood so well before the world as Mr. Slope did. As for quarreling with his daughter on account of such a marriage, and separating himself from her as the Archdeacon had threatened to do, that, with Mr. Harding, would be out of the question. If she should determine to marry this man, he must get over his aversion as best he could. His Eleanor, his own companion in their old happy home, must still be the friend of his bosom, the child of his heart. Let who would cast her off, he would not. If it were fated that he should sit in old age at the same table with the man of whom of all he disliked most, he would meet that fate as best he might. Anything to him would be preferable to the loss of his daughter. Such being his feelings, he had hardly knew how to take the part with Eleanor against the Archdeacon, or with the Archdeacon against Eleanor. It will be said that he should never have suspected her. Alas, he never should have done so. But Mr. Harding was by no means a perfect character. In his indecision, his weakness, his proneness to be led by others, his want of self-confidence, he was far from being perfect. And then it must be remembered that as such a marriage was as that which the Archdeacon contemplated with disgust, which we know Mr. Slope so well would regard with equal disgust, did not appear so monstrous to Mr. Harding, because in his charity he did not hate the chaplain as the Archdeacon did, and as we do. Trollope's narrator, or maybe Trollope himself, is reminding us that it's not just Mr. Grantley who hates Mr. Slope. We also hate him. He was, however, very unhappy when his daughter left the room, and he had recourse to an old trick of his that was customary to him in his time of sadness. He began playing some slow tune upon an imaginary violoncello, drawing one hand slowly backwards and forwards as though he had held a bow in it, and modulating the unreal chords with the other. It's an odd thing for him to be sitting there pretending that he's playing the cello. She'll marry that man as sure as 2 and 2 make 4, said the practical Archdeacon. I hope not, said the father. But if she does, what can I say to her? I have no right to object to him. No right, exclaimed Dr. Grantley. No right as her father. He is in my own profession, and for aught we know, a good man. To this the Archdeacon would by no means consent. It was not well, however, to argue the case against Eleanor in her own drawing room, and so they both walked forth and discussed the matter in all its bearings under the elms of the close. Mr. Harding also explained to his son-in-law what had been the purport, at any rate the alleged purport, of Mr. Slope's last visit to the widow. He, however, stated that he could not bring himself to believe that Mr. Slope had any real anxiety such as he had pretended. I cannot forget his demeanor to myself, said Mr. Harding, and it is not possible that his ideas should have changed so soon. His demeanor towards Mr. Harding himself refers to that chapter we read earlier, where Mr. Slope told Mr. Harding that the old ideas of how religion was done in Barchester were so much rubbish to be carted away, and made it pretty clear that he was thinking of Mr. Harding as part of the rubbish. I see it all, said the Archdeacon, the sly Tartuffe. He thinks to buy the daughter by providing for the father. He means to show how powerful he is, how good he is, and how much he's willing to do for her pretty eyes. Yet I see it all now. But we'll be too many for him yet, Mr. Harding, he said, turning to his companion with some gravity and pressing his hand upon the other's arm. It would perhaps be better for you to lose the hospital than to get it on such terms. Amazing how Mr. Grantley is. He might be incensed against Mr. Slope. He might hate Mr. Slope. But he sees right through him. His diagnosis of the situation, what did he put it? He thinks to buy the daughter by providing for the father is absolutely true. Lose it, said Mr. Harding. Why, I've lost it already. I don't want it. I've made up my mind to do without it. I'll withdraw altogether. I'll just go and write a line to the bishop and tell him that I withdraw my claim altogether. Nothing would have pleased him better than to be allowed to escape from the trouble and difficulty in such a manner. But he was now going too fast for the Archdeacon. No, no, no. We'll do no such thing, said Dr. Grantley. We'll still have the hospital. I hardly doubt that we'll have it, but not by Mr. Slope's assistance. If that be necessary, we'll lose it. But we'll have it, in spite of his teeth, if we can. Arabin will be at Plumstead tomorrow. You come over and talk to him. That's the key player that we haven't heard from yet, is Mr. Arabin. The two now turned into the cathedral library, which was used by the clergymen of the close as a sort of ecclesiastical club room for writing sermons and sometimes letters, also for reading theological works, sometimes magazines and newspapers. The theological works were not disturbed, perhaps, quite as often from the appearance of the building and the outside the public might have led to expect. Here the two allies settled on their course of action. The Archdeacon wrote a letter to the bishop, strongly worded, but still respectful, in which he put forward his father-in-law's claim to the appointment, and expressed his own regret that he had not been able to see his lordship when he called. Of Mr. Slope he made no mention whatsoever. That's what the meeting was going to be about. It was going to be Archdeacon Grantley pushing Mr. Harding's case. It was then settled that Mr. Harding should go out to Plumstead on the following day, and after considerable discussion on the matter, the Archdeacon proposed to ask Eleanor there also, so as to withdraw her, if possible, from Mr. Slope's attentions. Because he'll visit. If he knows the father is out at Plumstead Episcopi, he will go and visit her. A week or two, said he, may teach her what he is, and while she is there, she will be out of harm's way. Mr. Slope won't come out there after her. Eleanor was not a little surprised when her brother-in-law came back and very civilly pressed her to go out to Plumstead with her father. She instantly perceived that her father had been fighting her battles for her behind her back. She felt thankful to him. For his sake, she would not show her resentment to the Archdeacon by refusing the invitation. But she could not, she said, go on the morrow. She had an invitation to drink tea at the Stanhopes, which she had promised to accept. She would, she added, go with her father on the next day if he would wait, or she would follow him. The Stanhopes, said Dr. Grantley. I did not know you were intimate with them. I did not know it myself, said she, till Miss Stanhope called yesterday. However, I like her very much, and have promised to go and play chess with her, with some of them. Have they a party there? Said the Archdeacon, still fearful of Mr. Slope. Oh, no, said Eleanor. Miss Stanhope said there was nobody to be there at all. But she had heard that Mary had left me for a few weeks, and she had learnt from someone that I play chess, and so she came over on purpose to ask me to go in. Well, that's very friendly, said the ex-warden. They certainly do look more like foreigners than English people, but I dare say they are all none the worse for that. The Archdeacon was inclined to look upon the Stanhopes with favourable eyes, and had nothing to object on the matter. It was therefore arranged that Mr. Harding should postpone his visit to Plumstead for one day, and then take with him Eleanor, the baby, and the nurse. Mr. Slope is certainly becoming of some importance in Barchester. That's the last line of the chapter. So we see a possible wrinkle coming up here. The Archdeacon Grantley wants Mr. Harding to come out to Plumstead Episcopi so that he can confer with Mr. Arabin, who is a long-standing enemy of Mr. Slope, about what they're going to do. They're not going to give up the hospital. They just don't want Slope to dictate the terms. So the Archdeacon fires off a letter to the bishop saying, no, this isn't a settled matter. Mr. Harding is going into the hospital. We insist on his claim. And he wants Mr. Harding to come out to his home to talk with Mr. Arabin when he gets there. And he invites Eleanor because he wants her out of the clutches of Mr. Slope. She doesn't want him meeting with him anymore. He's working inroads on her when she should be part of the Grantleyite faction. But she has an appointment at the Stanhopes, this Addams Family cartoon collection that we've seen and we'll see again. She has an appointment with them to go and play chess and have some tea, just a social visit. So they're going to postpone the visit while she goes over there the next day. But what do we know about the Stanhopes? What have we learned? That Mr. Slope is sweet on one of the Stanhope children, Signora Madeline. She's at the Stanhope house. So Eleanor says, well, no, it's not a party. No one's going to be there at all. But what if she's there and Mr. Slope shows up? So we have a whole bunch of scenes that are coming up. We'll get that visit. We'll get the bishop's receipt of the Archdeacon's letter and his reaction to it. we will get Mr. Arabin at long last. So we will just keep plowing along with Barchester Towers. So I'll wrap this up here for now, and I will see you next time. Thank you, BookTube.